Lovely. So welcome everybody. I'm Jan Kappa from Cubo, and I'm really delighted to be facilitating this roundtable this morning. We are very, very privileged to have international participants and contributors today from New Zealand. The roundtable is hosted by StarRes, one of our corporate partners, who provide solutions in student housing and for housing communities across the world, I think. I saw that you have almost 2 million residents now under your technical care. So I'm going to hand you over to, a couple of protocols, sorry. The usual Zoom protocols, if you could stay on mute unless you're speaking, that will help with the sound quality. And to ask the participants questions, if you could put it in the chat and we'll manage it that way, as there's quite a big group today. And any questions that are not answered on the session, we will provide answers to in writing afterwards. We're also recording the session and we'll share that online with you, and the presentations will also be available. So we're going to run through, when we do the presentations, we're going to do them consecutively and then take the questions at the end. So if you have questions after the first presentation, if you could just wait until the second one, and then we'll start the Q&A properly. Okay, well, thank you. I'll hand you over now to Mark Stewart, who is Business Development Manager, EMEA at StarRes, who's going to take care of things from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan, and a warm welcome to everybody on the roundtable today. So on behalf of StarRes, we're delighted to be here today to sponsor this webinar in partnership with Cubo. As Jan said, StarRes is a global provider of student accommodation and conference management systems. But I think really importantly for today is that we're passionate about bringing our community together as often as possible. And I guess we all know that's been a little bit challenging of late. And like Cubo, through the Roundtable series, we've been adapting, to the online world to continue to bring best practice and learning. And we certainly hope today is no exception. So to sort of set the context for the webinar then, as we look round today, we kind of all know that we've been dealing with this pandemic in one way or another. Each region has its own experience and things vary from country to country, institution to institution even. Today you're going to hear from two members of the StarRes community from New Zealand, as Jan said, and they're going to share their observations, experiences and key learnings for how they were both impacted by the pandemic and what this meant to them through their journey, and now post-lockdown as we prepare for the return of students. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Amy Valentine, and she is the president of the New Zealand Association of Tertiary Education Accommodation, but mostly by day, is the head of halls at Massey University. With qualifications and work experience in education, youth development and professional supervision, Amy moved into student accommodation sector in 2015. Amy has been head of halls at Manawatu campus since the end of 2016, alongside her counterparts at Massey's Auckland and Wellington campuses, and was voted as the president of the New Zealand Association of Tertiary Education Accommodation at the end of 2018. So warm welcome to you, Amy, and thank you for supporting us today. And now let me introduce Jacob Waitere. Jacob is the head of operations for accommodation at the University of Auckland and manages all aspects of resident wellbeing and engagement, resident operations, customer care and service delivery, as well as the Department 2IC. I've no doubt we'll hear more about that in a second. Jacob has spent 11 years working in accommodation at universities, private operators and private residential colleges from Wellington to Auckland. Jacob has a bachelor's degree in education, psychology and English literature. Jacob is the vice president of the Asia Pacific Student Accommodation Association. As well as that role, he is also the conference convener, chair of communications and engagement committee and chair at the Asia Pacific Student Accommodation Association advisory group as well. Other activities include 3 years as president of the New Zealand Tertiary Education Association, 3-year member of the Kuhuai Global Initiative Network, and in 2018, Jacob was awarded the Fred Johnson Award for Innovation and Excellence in New Zealand Student Accommodation. Welcome, Jacob, and again, thank you to you two for supporting us today. I think it's fair to say that we are in great company with some really interesting insights, I hope, that we'll share over the next sort of 45, 50 minutes or so. As Jan said, please put your questions in the chat, and we'll look to obviously respond to those as we work through the presentations. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Amy to start the presentations. Amy, I'll stop sharing and hopefully you can pick things up from here.
Here we go. All right. Thank you very much, Mark. Kia ora koutou. As Mark has said, I am Amy Valentine, and I'm the head of halls at Massey, Manawatu, which is in Palmerston North, in the middle of the North Island in New Zealand, and I'm also the president following Jacob's departure a couple of years ago. Moved into that role with NZATEA. So I'm just going to give you a quick overview of kind of Massey University, because we're a little bit unique in New Zealand in that we have 3 campuses and we spread across the North Island. So we have a campus up in Auckland, which is our newest campus. We have 210 catered rooms of halls of residence up there. There is also 70 rooms within kind of 4 to 5 bedroom apartments, as well as 12 self-catered studio units. So that's our campus on Auckland, which is in the North Shore, so quite far away from the main centre where the likes of Jacob at University of Auckland are, and yeah, kind of a very, very new growing campus up there. Then we have the Manawatu, where I'm based in Palmerston North, and the university began back in 1926 as an agricultural college, so lots of farmland. If you think Cornell, if you've been to the States and visited any of their universities, very much agriculture is a big part. We've got the only vet school in New Zealand. We have a big equine centre, so a lot of students actually bring their horses along with them, and we're one of the few universities in New Zealand that is kind of based on a large campus with that real campus feel, and everything that you do, everything's within the campus, as opposed to again some of our other institutions which are in the bigger cities and they're kind of spread out across the city. So that's the uniqueness of us. We've got 696 rooms in catered halls, so our first year domestic is the main offering there, and then we've got another 233 rooms of self-catered, so our international and mature returning students, and then 9 family units, which is not enough for the demand, but a space that we're continuing to look into. Then we've got quite a boutique little campus in Wellington, so our capital at the bottom of the North Island, which is very much where our art and design school is based. And so we have 2 apartment blocks there across the road from each other, which are just off campus, and they have, the Cube has 261 beds and they're made up of apartments, and then across the road at Kaingaroa there's another 155 beds, and those are kind of single and twin share rooms, and then they've got the shared cooking spaces. Both of those spaces are self-catered because again they weren't kind of built for purpose, and that's again something that our Wellington campus continues to look into. So just under kind of 1,500 students or rooms available for students across the 3 campuses. So I guess going into the impacts of COVID-19 and how it has hit us at Massey. So semester 1 here in New Zealand goes from February through June. So if you think about kind of when this all started picking up and the world kind of started realizing that this is actually a really big thing that is starting to impact all of us, it was right before all of our students were arriving for the year. So at the end of January, we were kind of starting to get an idea that, hey, this might start having an impact, but it really wasn't until those last couple of weeks, just before students were expected to arrive, that we realised just how much this was going to impact us and our international numbers in particular. So it really had a significant impact on our international arrivals, in that, for example, at the Manawatu campus, where usually would have between 2 to 250 students coming internationally. At least 150 of them didn't turn up. A number of them were in New Zealand because they were returning students, so they might have been in Auckland, for example, for the summer working, and so they got back, but a large number of them didn't. And that meant, obviously, right from the get-go, we were significantly down in our numbers, but that for our domestic students, life kind of just got on as usual. And so orientation and the settling in period ran as normal. Everyone arrived mid-February, moving into the halls, super excited. All of our O Week events took place. You really couldn't have, you wouldn't have known coming into that space that it was any different in terms of what things looked like for that first year experience, that was anything different than it might have been last year, for example. However, those national conversations around border management and the impacts of all of these international students that weren't coming across the board, and what that meant for the sector, lots of discussions happening under the umbrella, for example, of Universities New Zealand, and how do we address that, and what kind of conversations do we need to be having with the government around considerations over do they make special considerations for international students coming, because of the impact that was going to have on that market. So those were kind of ongoing discussions that was at that point of time really taking place in the background, while those of us on the ground were just getting on with orientation and settling everybody in. Self-isolation requirements had started to become a thing at that point as well. And so along with settling all of our students in, we also had these background conversations and considerations as to, okay, what happens the more students that we get in that need to be self-isolated. So of course, this was where students that were starting to, sorry, a child in the background, students that were starting to have come into the country because they had perhaps not come from a country that, so for example, lots and lots of Chinese students that we were expecting that couldn't make it for obvious reasons at that time of the year, but some of them had taken themselves across to, for example, Thailand to isolate there for 2 weeks before they then travelled to New Zealand, and they were able to do that because we didn't have any travel restrictions for a number of other countries, and so they were kind of going into that process. But as they were making these decisions, our government was making decisions as to, okay, but which other countries now, again, as the pandemic became more global, which other countries do we need to consider putting restrictions in? So we would start having students arriving that had isolated themselves, whatever that might have looked like, in a separate country, at a resort or in a hotel, then expecting, right, I'm a week or so late, to lectures, and I missed out on the orientation, etc. However, I'll get to New Zealand in time to get underway with my studies. Get here only to 2 days beforehand have learnt that actually now New Zealand has put restrictions on that country. So those people that have just been isolating themselves now have to isolate a further 2 weeks in New Zealand. And the only place that they could do that, because they hadn't organised anywhere else and hotels weren't necessarily always on board at this point, was at the university. So we're all starting to think about how do we actually start to isolate students that are arriving that A, have already been isolating for 2 weeks, having left their home country of China 2 weeks before that, and are now coming into the university for the first time, not having been oriented, missing international orientation and registration, etc. Really keen to study, but now have to isolate in their room for a further 2 weeks and get connected and learn their ways around things. And how do we look after their welfare in that space? How are we feeding them? So delivering meals, what's the cleaning procedures that we need to put in place? All of these things being considered kind of on the go, whilst we've also got our brand new cohort of students settling in and going through all of those usual transition things. So it was quite a massive thing for us at the time. There were other things like impacts on staffing and shared response measures. So we had staff who, for one reason or another, had been travelling themselves. So we had a staff member who had gone to visit a child in Australia and had returned a couple of days in, and then the government had announced that anyone that's travelled over the last 14 days needs to go into isolation for a 2-week period, which meant that staff member, along with having been away 2 weeks of quite a critical time of the year, having sorted her kind of customer services team for the settling in period and moving in, so they'd done all of that, gone away for 2 weeks at what was seen, prior planning to be a good time to go, come back when everything was in chaos, back to the office for 2 days, and then sent home to isolate for 2 more weeks because she'd been travelling. And that was the new thing that the government had decided. And so things like that had really major impacts on our ability to kind of be working, going with the flow of all of these new things that were being put on us while we had other resourcing issues. We had a number of staff, people like cleaners who are, very much that front line work, who had different health needs and concerns that meant that they weren't comfortable being in that space when there were so many unknowns at that time. We're talking again back in February, March. So we were losing numbers of staff there as well, and trying to work out how do we manage this when actually we've got higher cleaning needs because everyone wants to ensure that we've got more surface cleaning and sanitisation, and all of these things are going on. Then we're going into, I mentioned earlier, all the different kind of travel restrictions that were starting to be put in place, and all of these students who were making attempts to come from other countries and to get started in the beginning of the semester. How could we isolate those people when we only had so many spaces available to isolate without impacting students that were currently in room? And of course, students that were in room are starting to get quite nervous about these international students that are starting to arrive. And what if, it was managing that whole discriminatory behaviour of, well, hold on, who's that person that's just arrived and that's isolating over there, and how do we know that they're not going to impact our health in any way? And so managing some of that stuff while also trying to work out, okay, if we got 10 more of these students that we needed to help isolate, where are we going to put them? Because we can't just pepper them across the rooms of those people that haven't arrived. So that meant reallocation and consolidation solutions. So we're talking 3 weeks into a new semester, all these new first year students having to turn around to them and say, right, all of you in this hall are going to move into the different gaps that we have in other halls because students haven't arrived. And so you think about all of that kind of sense of belonging work that you're trying to do at the beginning of the year, and completely undoing that all by kind of reallocating them. Only to have 3 days after you make everyone do these moves, the Prime Minister announced that we're going into lockdown in 2 days, which meant that whole reconsolidation and moving all of those students went by the by, and of course they were all quite upset, but now we have a new thing to deal with, which is lockdown. So on the 23rd of March, Monday afternoon, it was announced that at 11:59 p.m. on the coming Wednesday, so just over 48 hours later, New Zealand was going into lockdown. And that was called for us Alert Level 4. So that meant we had, with very little prior warning, again, lots of discussions going on from the universities and umbrellas of associations of universities and tertiary accommodation, etc., trying to reach out to the government saying, what do you want us to do, around isolation? How can we work with you to come up with solutions around international students, this, that, and the other thing? No real indication that this was coming quite so quickly, and then very little guidance when it was announced as to this is what it means for student accommodation in the tertiary sector. So really clear guidelines to the likes of primary schools and of course high schools and colleges in terms of all schools will be closing down in the next 48 hours. Preferably if you don't have to send your children to school over the next 2 days, please don't, but if you need to, they'll still be open. So everyone knows that they're shutting down, businesses know that they're shutting down, lecturers know that they're no longer teaching in person, but those of us in student accommodation are going, okay, this is how we're interpreting it. We've tried to get some guidance from our, health and safety, etc., to kind of get some answers as to, is what we're doing around isolation, etc., the right thing. Even then we were getting really little kind of feedback. So ultimately it came down to every university or every institution has 48 hours to work out what on earth they're doing, to convey that to the students and their families, and put it into place. And so that meant the provision of meals, financial implications. Do we provide rent relief? Do we not? What does a bubble mean? Because this was part of the level 4 requirement from a New Zealand perspective. So our Prime Minister talked a lot about bubbles, which I understand is starting to be picked up around the globe as well. So that the people that you live with are your bubble, and you really don't have any contact with anyone outside of your bubble, outside of walking past them in the supermarket as distantly as you possibly can. And so what does a bubble mean when you're living in the halls environment? How, when you've got a maximum of so many people, does that mean that we are keeping people within their flats? Does that mean that we're keeping people within their floors? Do we say that a whole hall is a bubble, providing we know that they're not going anywhere else, i.e. therefore we have to stop them from going to the supermarket, etc. Can we provide all of the meals and other needs that they, and so all of those kinds of considerations, having to make those within 48 hours and communicate that to students who had 48 hours to decide whether they were staying or going. So we had about 400 remain on campus across our 3 campuses, so 400 total. That was 200 for us here in the Manawatu and about 100 at each of the other campuses. Stay on site through lockdown, which meant that for us, that meant maintaining their bubbles. We had the right amount of people staying that we were actually able to justify that each hall group was a bubble. So we didn't have any more than 10 still in the hall. A lot of our flats, of course, were just their own bubbles in themselves. We had to put things into place like providing a set meal plan, and that they would go in, because of the way that we've got kind of 16 halls on our campus that are spread across the campus, and so they all actually had to go into the dining hall and collect their takeaway meal and go back to their rooms at staggered times so that they weren't cross-contaminating bubbles, I guess you could say. And we did, one of the decisions that the university did make was to provide rental relief during that lockdown period. This is a really contentious thing in New Zealand and created quite an uproar, which I'll talk a little bit about a little bit later. And then what we really then focused on is how do we ensure we've got engagement from our students during this time. So we have to maintain our bubbles. We as managers couldn't go into the halls unless of course there was an emergency need to do so. So we were quickly moving into that virtual world, both within our meetings and cross-campus meetings, but particularly with our students and trying to get them and keep them engaged. So things like this picture of Anzac Day, so our commemoration day, getting people to make poppies in their own spaces and then having them displayed in windows and things, just like you have teddy bears displayed in windows, so poppies were a thing. Our Wellington colleagues at the Wellington campus did a YMCA TikTok, so they were all outside their apartments doing YMCA early in the morning, and that got in the media and things. So just, yeah, really trying to find new ways of getting them to connect. When we moved into level 2, which was the 11th of May, it was announced that we were moving into level 2, so we were at a space that we would then able to, so sorry, that's a really big time frame from around late March to early May that we are going between levels 3 and 4. And effectively all of those bubbles and requirements kind of stayed in place. There were a number of people when we moved into level 3, which was not a lot different to level 4, that wanted to come back to campus because they'd been at home with their parents for 4 weeks or somewhere else for 4 weeks, and they were really over it and wanted to come back, but we had to kind of, the Ministry of Education really made it quite clear that no one is to return student accommodation at level 3. Yeah, and so level 2 meant that there was more flexibility in this regard. So level 2 meant that bubbles were able to extend in the community. A lot of restaurants and things were starting to be able to open again. The physical distancing had reduced to 1 metre, and so on, gathering limits of 10 people. But yeah, so just a little bit more flexible, and this is when we're kind of able to open up our doors again and have residents come back. We had about 80% of those that went home come back, and it just meant that we had to do a lot of adjustments to our social spaces and activities. So still had limits on how many people could be in different spaces at different times. A lot of discussion across the New Zealand kind of tertiary sector around, do we allow the students to drink or not? Like, what kind of impacts will that have? If they're drinking and socialising, are they going to be able to maintain and make good decisions around maintaining social distancing, etc.? So on our campus, you can see here on the right, we came up with kind of a, this is the key information that we want you being aware of when you come back on. This is how we contact trace. This is the number, you know, there's going to be posters in all of the different spaces as to how many people we expect to be in that space at that time. If you're sick, please don't go anywhere, contact us so we can manage all of that very quickly. And we made that decision, as you can see in the bottom right, that there would be no buses going into town, so our buses that take our students to town on a night to go clubbing, etc. However, we would allow them to drink in those spaces, providing they were maintaining distancing, because again, we wanted to maintain as much of that normality as possible and as much of that socialisation, but we wanted to do it in managed ways. It's level 2. Then with no cases in New Zealand, and sorry if it feels like I'm rushing through this, with no cases active in New Zealand, on the 8th of June, it was announced that we were, sorry, the previous week, it was announced that on the 8th of June, we were moving to level 1. So that was super exciting, and that really meant that while we were still expected as a country, and are still expected as a country, because we're still in level 1, to continue with contact tracing, life could essentially go back to normal. The tricky thing about this for us was that it was right before exam time. And so, you know, lectures, if they had existed in real life at that point in time, would have been ending anyway for study break, and students would be going into exams. So a lot of students were choosing not to come back. And there were a lot of questions over where we had provided rental relief over the lockdown period. We had lifted that relief at level 2 because students could come back. A lot of students held off coming back immediately because they weren't sure if we were going to flip back into going up the levels again. And so by the time they had deemed it safe to come back, they thought, well, it's a waste of time because exams are about to be delivered and they're all being delivered online. So we don't want to come back. We'll come back in semester 2. Therefore, we expect to have that rental relief continue to be provided. And, you know, calls from parents, etc. You know, why would you start charging our children again if they're not coming back until semester 2, which is 6 weeks away? So they're wasting their money if they, you know, you expect them to pay for accommodation that they don't require, etc. This is where I said this was one of our big issues here in New Zealand, and it actually opened up a whole government inquiry into student accommodation, despite, as Jacob said right at the beginning of the call, all this assurance that the tertiary sector is coping really well and is financially well placed in this situation, unlike many others who are getting a lot of relief. On the flip side, we're also, there's been a lot of criticism by politicians, and it is an election year, as well as other student associations, etc., over the different decisions that were made by different institutions based on their interpretation as well as their unique needs of how to get through this. So that's been really challenging, because I think our Prime Minister has been amazing, and we know in terms of the global stage, she's been receiving lots of kudos, etc., because our big focus has been, you know, we're working as one 5 million people team, and we are going to be kind to each other, and we are going to, you know, get really tough right from the beginning and then hopefully come out of it, and that's all happened really well. And there's been lots of praise for the health sector and praise for all of these different areas and relief provided in these different areas. And then our staff across the sector who have been working day and night, right from the beginning to try and manage the isolation and the international arrivals as it was, and doing an amazing job at that. To then be continuing to support students throughout the lockdown period, which, as you will all know, has significant impacts on people's health and well-being, and you know, an increase in welfare concerns, different people managing that isolation differently, still working crazy hours overnight, still, you know, helping to drive people to testing stations when they need testing, etc., to then on the flip side be being kind of pummeled in the media space and on social media by politicians who are, you know, on the other hand, you know, sending this message of being kind to one another. That's been quite disheartening and really challenging for all of us. And it's actually pitted in some ways the universities against each other at a time that we really needed to be uniting and relying on each other for support during this period. Because, well, why has this university chosen to give rental relief, or this university's only chosen to give partial rental relief, or this university hasn't given any relief whatsoever, and why on earth would you all make such different decisions with very little appreciation that actually there was no guidance given whatsoever from the get-go, nor any relief, nor any of that larger context appreciation of, well, we still have to maintain our buildings, we still need staff in these spaces, we need to be ready when your students are ready to come back, etc. So that's probably been one of the bigger challenges in this period for us. I've talked kind of about the return to normal, where different people chose to come back. You know, many people chose to come back because they were just fed up with being at home, but a lot of people chose to stay home and then come back for semester two. Semester two for us did start a fortnight ago, and life really does feel pretty much back to normal. And I know that that's really odd to probably for many of you to be hearing and to feel like, is life going to be able to get back to normal? But outside of having our international students coming in, which of course, you know, is a massive gap for us, in terms of the student body, in terms of people's enthusiasm to be back on campus and learning in person and engaging with one another, it's been really nice over the last few weeks to just see all of the students out there. And I think one of the biggest, the most positive things, I guess, for me from the whole experience was just seeing the students' attitudes when they came back. You know, I talked earlier about questions over drinking, etc., and what would the impacts of that be when they come back into, you know, are they going to be able to make good decisions around distancing or looking after their health, or all of that stuff under the influence of alcohol and all those other potential risks or concerns that we might have had. They've actually been incredible and really respectful of staff and each other and considerate, and that's been really cool. So I guess just quickly going into my learnings, I think for me, really big one was communication. Creating an expectation of what that communication would look like. Everyone, and again, this is global, everyone was put on the back foot with this and is trying to work out how to manage on the go. I think one of the key things is just really appreciating that while we aren't going to have the answers immediately for much of this, because it's changing constantly, it's about creating a plan of communication and then letting your students know and your families know this is how we're going to communicate things. So when an announcement is made by the government, you can expect that we will come, you know, back to you within a 24-hour period as to how we're implementing that. Otherwise, we get inundated with all these emails of questions about this, that, and the other thing, and we want explanations. And it's much easier for us to be able to get that one big communication out there rather than kind of responding to the various. But just again, yeah, managing expectations. Being really, really okay in yourself of being able to say, actually, we don't have all the answers immediately. So this was one of our biggest things for Massey in particular around that first 48-hour period of we're going into lockdown. These are all the things we need to consider. What are we going to do? Are we going to charge our students that go home, or are we not? And we actually kind of went, you know what? We don't know yet. We need some time to work this all out. We need some time to work out the implications of catering. We need to know, you know, what our partners who help provide our services need and things. And so we sat for a few days on not knowing what that would look like, but being really clear with our people about we don't know, and as soon as we do know, we'll let you know. And this is kind of the time frame that we want to achieve that within. And that allowed us, we got a lot of kickback from that initially. We got, well, this university down there has made this decision, you know, 2 hours after the Prime Minister made their announcement. Why haven't you made this decision? 3 weeks later, that university is being pummeled by the media over the decisions that they made so quickly. And so again, it was for us, it was about going, you know what, we don't have to have the answers straight away. What we do need to do is be able to be really certain that what we do end up deciding we're going to provide or we're going to be able to do, we can actually do. And we can, you know, feel confident in being able to do that. So that was something as well that we learnt. And then the biggest thing for me is always utilising the strengths that exist within your team and the community. Really going back to the basics of where can we, you know, we're working in a really different way. This is impacting all of us, staff as well as students, in different ways, both those students that are still on campus as well as those students that are at home. We want to be engaging and creating opportunities for all of them to engage with us as well as with their peers, regardless of whether they're still in the halls or at home wanting to come back into the halls. What are the different ways we can do that? So things like one of our assistant managers down in Wellington, who is fantastic with social media, him really getting things going with his community around the TikToking and all of that stuff, and really building that kind of culture there. Whereas for us, it was a lot more of the artistic approach and getting communications out in different ways, particularly for us on our campus with quite a large international cohort still on campus. And so just, yeah, again, using those strengths that exist, using the students' strengths within the community and getting them to support each other and come up with ideas and get creative themselves, and appreciating that we can't do everything, and we are, you know, we're managing all the admin behind all of this, along with trying to create this constant you know, continually developing the community. So let's get everyone else on board and help us do that. And I think people are in a really good place at the moment for, yes, they might be frustrated at times, yes, they might struggle with their own welfare, but generally people want to help each other during this time. And so I'm pretty keen to get on board. And then just in closing, a Māori proverb, kia hata mea nui o te ao, he tangata, he tangata, he tangata. So what is the most important thing in the world? It is the people, and that's ultimately, again, really reinforced over this period, is just at the end of the day, if we're all looking out for each other, and everyone's doing their part and everyone's chipping in, and there's acknowledgement that actually, yep, we're struggling, and just give me a day to get my head around something. I think that's really important, and I guess encourage everyone to just continue to remind that, because it does get really tough and we just kind of have to look out for each other. So that's me. Thank you.
Amy, that's brilliant. Thank you very much. Really appreciate your story. And there's loads of questions that we'll get to in a minute. So Jacob, hand over to you to sort of take over the reins. You want to stop sharing, Amy? That's good. We can see your screen, Jacob.
Perfect. Alrighty. Talofa lava, malalo ele, kia ora ana, kia ora iti whānau, and warm Pacific greetings from quite a chilly Aotearoa, New Zealand here. So I don't know about Amy, but I've got a blanket on my lap. As it's night time. So thank you first of all to Kubo and Starres for inviting us today. It's great to be able to kōrero with you all. Yeah, we simply love dealing with Starres in our part of the world, and I hope that you guys are enjoying it over there as well. So I'll whip through mine because Amy's covered a lot of the timeline stuff, which is really helpful. And I'm opening up with a whakatauki, which is our departmental whakatauki, which is He Waka Eke Noa, which is we're all in this together. And it was the whakatauki, the proverb that the New Zealand government adopted throughout COVID-19 as well. So it was quite fitting, because I sort of went to my student residential staff, see, this is why we have these things, you know, it's not just me and my craziness at 12 o'clock at night. It's a legit thing that other people do. So for those that don't know about the University of Auckland, we're New Zealand's largest university with over 40,000 students. We have over 5,500 staff. We're a research intensive university with a comprehensive teaching program. So what that means is that we have an engineering school, a law school, and a med school. So we've got a few of the key STEM subjects and to complement our business and humanities. I have to mention these things. We're 81st in the world by QS World Rankings, and we are #1 in the world for the Times Higher Education Sustainable Development Impact. So I was able to get the team to not have those logos on the slide, but I have to throw that in there. About our accommodation, so we have 4,500 beds ish on our campus. 2,000 of those are traditional catered halls of residence that house our first year university students. So our first year university student model is that they go into a catered hall of residence in a traditional corridor style setting. So single bedrooms, communal bathrooms, communal dining. And we have 2,500 beds in self-catered facilities. So we made a decision a few years ago to invest in self-catered over catered, as it was a more defensible model for us, which is working quite well for us in COVID-19. We're split across 3 functional areas. So we've got our accommodation solutions team. They do applications to accommodation advisory on external accommodation in our marketing. Accommodation operations, which is my team, we deliver the product. We are the student support and operations, and then we have accommodation commercial, which includes our corporate finance, facilities, contract management, and our summer stay, so our commercial summer business. So I've just got a chart here about our growth. So when I started in 2011, we had 1,800 beds, and then this year, because the world was looking rosy 5 years ago when you do a business case, we decided to open 1,200 new beds in February at the start of our academic year. Lo and behold, guess what? That was the exact number of international students that didn't arrive. So what a great time to you know, have a huge growth in your bed numbers. And we've got more beds under construction at the moment. So it's really interesting when you do our business recovery to have a look at how do you fill those beds when you've got some empty ones now, and as Amy and I have mentioned, no international students coming anytime soon to old Fortress, New Zealand. So we've been on a huge growth plan for us. So we've never had a year where we've never not added a building since 2011. So it's been quite interesting to always be in a stage of flux in how we do things. So the University of Auckland, our students on campus, so we're predominantly female, 57.5%. This is reflective, I think, of most institutions in New Zealand. 42% male, and we have 0.5% that identify as gender diverse. The top countries that we recruit from, and I've put this up here because you'll understand how it impacted our international student numbers. China is #2 for us. So that's when we lost 1,200 students. It was, you know, from these main countries. So China and Hong Kong, really high. Japan, Singapore and the US coming in there at 5th, and then Malaysia and the UAE. India, though, while not in our top 6, because New Zealand is obviously #1 naturally, but our top 5 international, India is our fastest growing. So all bets were on India, and now it's, well, probably not India, depending how COVID looks overseas. And then as you can see on the other side, we're a really science intensive campus. Science and engineering make up 75% of our on-campus students. So 75% of our residential students are in a STEM-based subject, which is really interesting when you're working with those types of students. So this slide here is it's a very messy, I didn't quite space it out like Amy, I'm just trying to keep my slides minimal, timeline of what happened in New Zealand. So as Amy mentioned, you know, in December, we started monitoring the virus in Wuhan. It was very near to some of our research centers that we have based in China. We'd just opened a China-New Zealand college over there as well for some teaching. in early January, the strategic response team was formulated, which is made up of university representatives, which is this wonderful thing where at 8 o'clock every morning, we all had to start work with an hour-long COVID update. And then the incident management team got involved. So the difference between strategic response and the incident management team is our strategic response is made up of what I'll call on-the-ground staff, heads of departments, type thing, and the incident management team is led by the Vice Chancellor of the university. So it becomes quite a big thing in our university operations. In February, as Amy mentioned, the 14-day isolation requirement came into effect, and we isolated our students. So we controlled their waste and hazard bags, we fed them, we made sure they didn't leave their room, we did their pastoral care. So we were doing that for a number of students. On the 28th of February, we had our first COVID case reported in New Zealand, a traveller from Iran, and that was 4 days after our move-in day. So it was pretty early on in O week. And then March is really interesting for us to look at, because by the time the 25th rolled down, when we were going into a state of emergency and all of our lovely smartphones buzzing away with "you are in a state of emergency," we were week 4 into our academic year. So we had moved in students, orientated them, and then we were preparing for them to make an adult decision on where to go, and I'll talk about that later. But then pretty quickly, we were moving down the steps from levels 4 to 3 to 2 to 1. So it was a pretty rapid movement for us. And from June the 8th, life has been pretty much back to normal. So it's been a roller coaster for us, and it's very different to what's happening overseas. So I find it very difficult to talk about what we're doing, because yeah, it's life here is like it was before COVID, except you just can't leave and you can't visit. So when the Prime Minister announced our alert level system, this is what we were given. And as you can see, it's very light in information for any industry. But this is what we had 2 days to base our response on. And the Ministry of Education, 24 hours before we went into lockdown, released a bulletin to all education providers saying you must remain open for student accommodation. So Prime Minister says in 2 days we're going into lockdown. We have 1 day where we're telling students you've got to make your choice where to go. Day 2, the Ministry of Education comes in late to the party, as most government departments can often be, and go, sorry team, you're still staying open, which we had planned to anyway. And this is what we had to go on with some dotted information from regional public health. So it was very light for us to begin with. And then as we went on through lockdown, the government filled in the lines a little bit more for us. So we had very little time to respond, but we were prepared. So we lost 1,200 international students very early on who were evacuated to their home countries. And that was really hard because lots of those students did not want to go back. So we had students from Europe, from America, from China, who were recalled by their insurance companies or their home institutions, who thought they were being put back into danger by going through international airports and having to leave the country, and that New Zealand was going to be safe for them. So we were dealing with that while also dealing with our domestic students. Out of our 3,500 students that remained contracted with us, 1,600 decided to remain on campus, which is about 45%, which is a large number for us. We were really lucky that some of us might remember the swine flu days, and that we had really robust isolation practices and business recovery and continuity plans from that we were able to repurpose quite quickly. And then we had to work around tweaking our bubble system, as Amy said. So we made no decision we made a conscious decision not to combine students into buildings. We decided to keep them in their room spaces, whether it's their single room, their apartment, their studio, because that's their home. And if you were in a private setting, you wouldn't be asked to all go into one building. So as Amy said, some other universities, because we're so small with 8 universities in New Zealand, combined all students into one building, which is great for that university. It wasn't the model we took. So for us, it was a 3-tiered bubble plan. Your individual space was your space. Even if you were in the same building, you could not visit each other in each other's bedrooms. But you were part of a sub-bubble, we called it, which was either your floor or your block or your flat. And then you're part of a very secure residential facility bubble. So we were more locked down than a private apartment building in terms of our students. And similar to Amy, we did capacity restrictions on rooms. We didn't do the takeaway meal thing. We thought it was better for us to just have staggered meal times for them to be able to eat and be social. We thought that was important for their mental health. And for the very first time for us, we communicated directly with parents. And that's rare for New Zealand, because if you're over 18, I'm sure it's in the world, you know, if you're over 18 years old, you're not actually legally allowed to communicate to a guardian or a parent unless they're in a life-threatening situation. So we made the decision to communicate. Within 24 hours, our whole semester 1 engagement program had been put into an online forum, and we can talk more in depth about that if people have questions about what we did. We were the fastest university department to go online, second to teaching. As I said, we enforced our stance on being that it's a student's adult right to make a decision as to whether they remain on campus or they go home, much to the despair of many of the parents who thought that we should force everyone back. The number one question we got was around, well, if I leave, do I still have to pay rent? And we could not make that decision very quickly. We did make a decision, and we did not give free accommodation. We gave a significant rental discount for a period of time to those who did not remain on site. If you remained on site, you paid a full fee because you were still receiving a full service. So our subsidy came from a decrease in utilities and meal costs in the catered environment. So just quickly on preparing to come back. So New Zealand's got a COVID tracer app similar to many countries. The number one thing that we did, and it's a recommendation I would give to many others, is that all of our regional public health, our government bodies said that you must be able to assist in contact tracing at a very short notice. So if we had a suspected case in our accommodation, that whole person gets put into managed isolation. If it's a confirmed case, our whole residential facility, that whole building is put into a managed quarantine. So what we did for every student coming back, and similar to Amy, we went from having 45% on campus to, as soon as we got to level 2, about 80% of our students on campus. They all had to fill in a pre-arrival form, which outlined their specific travel requirements, who they were isolating with, where were they isolating, confirming their health for the last 14 days, so that if there was any issues with a student potentially having COVID-19, we could provide all of that contact tracing for every student who recently arrived. And we were signing in and out of buildings as well to the government quickly. Now we've moved past, and everyone was sort of life as normal. We use the government's contact tracing app. So people, contractors, students, visitors will scan a QR code on our door, and that's their choice. The government doesn't actually make it a legal requirement anymore. We staggered our arrivals, and we encouraged physical distancing for the first few days, and every student had to have an in-person briefing as to the expectations of conducting themselves in our accommodation facilities. Throughout COVID, right up until level 1, every contractor had to sign a declaration form declaring their health, who they were living with, where their residential address was, all that sort of stuff. So if it was their first time coming back onto campus to do maintenance work or any sort of life safety stuff, they had to do those declaration forms. Again, contact tracing, and for them to stop and think, am I endangering this group of young people by entering their facility? We did staggered rules for each level of COVID-19. We actually got harsher as the levels got lower. So we had no alcohol ban during level 4. Students could drink if they had alcohol. But level 1, when they were all coming back in, there was an alcohol ban for the first couple of weeks, and no guests. So we maintained no guests for 2 weeks. And the reason being is that students were coming back for a social experience, and we didn't want to further blur any expectations by going, you have to be physically distant, but you can have all your friends over and yeah, absolutely have a bit of a knees up. So yeah, and then we heavily promote the government's contact tracing app. So I'm not going into in depth because you guys can ask questions about what we did, how and why. So our learnings, and I've got a picture there. So I grew a COVID beard during lockdown, or even though I was working from home and from campus. So all of our accommodation staff were deemed essential workers. So it's really scary for students going through this. So it's not often in New Zealand our smartphones go off with you are in a state of emergency. So we made a decision after every government announcement, which was happening at 1 p.m. daily, if there was a significant decision made and not just a general update, that me as head of the accommodation department would do a Facebook update for our students. Not all students know who I am. There's 4,500 of them. So to humanize me as a person translating government and university speak, they tracked my COVID beard throughout the lockdown. So by the end of it, it got really impressive, which many of the students that have known me as RAs, etc., were a bit sort of shocked by. A bit too ginger for my liking, but again, it was a way to humanize the messaging that I was sending through. So our biggest fluctuations in guidelines did not come from the Ministry of Health or the central government. It came from the Ministry of Education. 1 minute they're saying you take students back, the next minute they're saying you don't take students back. So we often had to ignore or bend the education guidelines. One of the things that I would encourage all institutions to do is be confident in your organization's approach to how you've met COVID-19. As long as you know you're meeting the Ministry of Health guidelines, who cares if other universities are going over the top or if they're going under? It's about what you're confident in as a leader. Students are hard to keep apart. They will often not understand the impact of their actions. And so we made a decision. We're in a national state of emergency. We're going to protect you by giving you information. But if you decide to flout that in a state of lockdown, I'm not going to stop the police coming and talking with you. So we had students decide to do a pancake party, about 50 of them in alert level 4, where you couldn't have any groups together. And I let the police ride in through the front door because they were making a decision to flout a government rule. It wasn't something I had made up. So why would I stop a government enforcement agency having a conversation with them? Now, I also well knew that the police had we warn you once and then we charge you the second time. So I knew that they'll just get a stern talking to, and it helped make the situation real. A tip is know the business continuity plans of all your contractors and all your partners. So I've never learned so much about cleaning sprays in my life than I did in 1 hour, 24 hours before we went into lockdown. But I had to be confident that every one of my contractors and third-party providers had a robust plan in place, because I was the one putting hand on heart to parents that we've got everything we need. Always return to your basics. Students are going to be happy if they're warm, they're fed, and they've got Wi-Fi. So we made sure that our Wi-Fi could handle the extra load from all the Netflixing that was going to be occurring in lockdown, because otherwise that is the number one thing I would have had it in the neck from. Communication is important, so you need to make sure that you're doing multiple ways to communicate your messaging. So we were doing posts as a social media. Like I said, for every government update and then every university update, we did a Facebook Live Q&A with myself, so that there was a bit of authority there, that it wasn't the day-to-day hall manager, but it wasn't so serious that it was the Director of Student Services talking to them. Remember that you're not alone. Collaborate and support. I've been really appreciative of the networks such as NZATEA, APSA, Aku Hawaii, where you can just spitball ideas with people. And then lastly, it's review. So I know some of my colleagues opted to do daily team meetings via Zoom. I made a conscious decision, well, I wouldn't meet daily with all of my direct reports in a normal day, so why would I during COVID? We met at specific milestones and times to review something. So if we implemented a new measure, such as a new social activity program, online gaming, etc., then we met the day after to review. If the government was doing a level 1 announcement, we met before to make sure that we knew who was watching and who was collecting what information, and then we met after to implement and formulate our plans. So those are some of the biggest learnings we did, was that it wasn't about keeping in touch every day. We tried to keep business as usual. We kept all of our office hours open for students, etc. But it was about being strategic and when we did get together, because Zoom fatigue is a very real thing, as we know out there. And that's a very whirlwind for me at the University of Auckland. I just wanted to make sure that I was able to answer lots of questions, because again, what Amy and I are living through here in New Zealand is really different, you know, and I know that there's an easing up in the northern hemisphere, but again, I can freely walk down the street and have people over and not worry about community transmission. All of our COVID cases are in managed isolation hotels. They've all come from overseas. So yeah, would I say our students were satisfied with how we dealt with everything during COVID-19? Well, on one hand, I think yes. I think what the biggest learning for the university, so my institution's biggest learning is that online education isn't a great equalizer. It actually highlights disparities in a student's background and personal circumstances. So what was coming forward at our university is that previous equity champions in the university who thought that accommodation was just for the privileged who could afford that, and we have a very robust scholarships program, and who thought it would be great for students from low-income families or certain Indigenous backgrounds to go back to their family homes and do online learning, actually came back to discover, well, actually that home doesn't have good Wi-Fi. That home has one laptop that's being shared amongst all these students who are doing high school or primary school education. You know, that families saved up so much money for that one university student to have that laptop or tablet. So for us, accommodation became viewed as, through our scholarship program, as a great platform for everyone to have an equitable first go at university. So our university has actually invested in about 250 more scholarships to help fund accommodation, so that in the future, lots more students from low decile schools, which is our socioeconomic school rating system, can have access to accommodation. So that was great from the university. From us, we take a lot of pride in that we were one of the first universities to do all online engagement and pastoral care, as well as deliver in-person support for those that needed it. So it was a really hard 4 weeks, but I think, you know, in level 4, but as a country, I think that we've appreciated the fact that for us, we've got no second wave coming anytime soon, fingers crossed. So yeah, alrighty then. Mark, Jan, I'm not sure which one of you will facilitate, but that's me done.
I'll just quickly say, Jacob, thank you very much. And I just ask everybody if they can just spare a few more minutes. I know that we're running a little bit over, and I guess we'll just take a few of the questions out of the chat, and those we don't get to, I guess we'll answer offline. But Jan, back to you.
Yes, I'm thinking that if Amy and Jacob could stay on anyway, we can answer all the questions perhaps in this and then make it available as a recording. So that's another option if we just carry on, and then we'll have a longer recording that people can watch afterwards. So I'm going to look at the questions. I'm going to start with in the order that they came up. So the first question is for Amy. How long did you have the catered students collect their meals as takeaways? And did they have facilities in their halls to reheat? And were they compliant, or were they vocal against it? And that's from Joe De Silva.
Yeah, no, they were pretty compliant. Their biggest concern actually was being told that they had to collect meals from the dining hall still, and that they couldn't all go off to the shops and purchase, like basically self-cater. Because they were so nervous about being in space with other people, not quite appreciating just what it looked like on the outside world in terms of massive long lines outside supermarkets, etc., and that there was a higher chance that they'd get something out there versus within the university bubble. However, there were some concerns over not having the same amount of variety as usual, etc., which was always really interesting, but ultimately they got on board with it. The fact that we had staggered them in different timings, they could go back, yes, in their halls, because they were within, like Jacob, we didn't move people. Yes, we had that early on consolidation effort before we went into lockdown, but once we were in lockdown, yep, we had in some halls 2 to 3 people in a 50-bedroom hall, but that was okay because that was a good size bubble, and that meant that they could be in the living room together, or the common room together, watching movies, etc., reheating their food that they'd brought back from the dining hall. Yeah, so it worked, yeah, just fine. Again, after 2 days, almost every time we made a change, they had 2 days to kind of get their heads around things and to grumble and moan and have us kind of explain or justify, and then they settled down and got on with it.
Thanks, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Thanks. Second question to you, Amy. Did you find you had any students that didn't want cleaners entering their flats? And did you have any large outbreaks in the residences? And actually, somebody's got 3 questions in here. Did you find students stuck to their bubbles?
Yeah, so we had no outbreaks within Massey University, and I think there might have been one in one of the halls in New Zealand very, very early on. And I'm now trying to work out whether that was an international one that I remember hearing of or not, but it was managed super well in the halls, and the bubbles were maintained really well. No, students didn't always stick to them, but like Jacob, we have very close relationships with our local police. We had one of the sergeants, the local sergeants, actually do a video, a Facebook video live chat with our students after the first week of them, you know, kind of walking across to the bridge, because we have a bridge that separates us from our small city, and they, you know, had come across some in the middle of the night drinking at the bridge, and after that, along with a couple of other things, including visiting each other at other halls, which was a no-no because it's separate bubbles. They put that video out there, and they were really clear about their expectations and what they would do if they needed to enforce those expectations a little bit further. And that's all it took, really, for them to kind of, yeah, pull their heads in and appreciate, again, like Jacob said, appreciate that we're just really actually implementing what the government's asking us to implement. Yeah.
Thanks. Quick one here is, would you be happy to share the poster for students that you showed in one of your slides?
Yeah, I can flick that. I'll flick that through to you, Jan.
Thank you very much. And then from Laura Spearing, she'd be really interested to know how you implemented restrictions in communal areas such as laundry rooms, libraries, gyms, and have those restrictions lifted now with social distancing, or have there been long-term changes?
Yeah, so one of the blessings of our government going hard and fast early is that our libraries and our gyms all shut down. Everything went shut down. So that's where it was, that very kind of student accommodation was left at the end going, we're still open, no one else is. How do we manage this? Because, yeah, so the dining hall was very much only catering to our students that were in residence, whereas usually they've got a commercial operation going on as well. There was no one else on campus. It was a ghost town. So the gym was closed. Yes, they still had communal laundries, but because of the numbers that we had, it was easy to manage either staggering times if it was a shared community laundry, or the fact that we knew that actually between those two halls, there's less than 10 people still here using that laundry. So it wasn't actually an issue for us.
Okay, thank you. And then a question from Robin Walsh, interested in the scenario where you have an international student isolating in a shared flat, and how you then manage the expectations and issues the other residents have with this.
Yeah, we're very lucky in that we've got some respite rooms on campus. And so those students who were, and so respite rooms being if someone has a mental health need that comes up, that they just need to be isolated by themselves while they're in a quieter space, or if they've got a contractable illness or otherwise, that we've got those spaces. So we don't have a huge number of them, but we didn't have a huge number of students coming in. However, that was that point that we got to where we went, of our 4 rooms that we've got available, if we get one more student in the next fortnight that needs isolating, we're going to get stuck. So we need to decant this hall, which was the hall that has our highest bathroom to bedroom ratio, kind of, and the way that the flats are set out. So it's a number of pods within kind of a stack of concrete courts. And so we kind of went, well, that would be the best space for isolation, because we can have 2 people within one pod of 5 bedrooms, because there's 2 bathrooms, and they could each be in their own rooms, having their own bathroom, and we could actually have up to 48 people within that space isolating if we really needed to. And so that was that big decision that we were making, because we didn't know if the government was going to make a decision to open the borders to international students. We didn't know if we were just going to have more students doing the, I'll go to this country and then I'll come to your country. So that's where we did the decanting, so that we didn't end up in a situation where we had someone isolating within a shared flat. So that wasn't a thing for us.
Okay, thank you. Oops, sorry. Question for Jacob now. Jacob, this is from Joe De Silva. Why keep students from having other students in their rooms if they are in the same bubble? And was it adhered to? Was it well received? Or was that the principle but left to their personal choice?
Kia ora, and great question, Joe. So the main reason for us is that, I mean, we've got beautifully comfortable furnished 10 square metre bedrooms in most cases, or a studio is about 15 to 20 square metres. So the government requirement during level 4 was that you had to remain 2 metres apart at all time, except for maybe within your individual household. Because of the nature and the risk with high-rise residential living, whether you're a private apartment or a university accommodation, we wanted to try and minimise as many risks as possible. So we said, you can socialise in our lounges where you've got X capacity and we know that you can be comfortably 2 metres apart, but we don't want you in a bedroom with someone where it's hard to be 2 metres apart. Or you know, it also helped with a social aspect that if students wanted to be social, they had to leave their bedroom and mingle with others. Was it well adhered to? Well, I think with it, like I said, students are hard to keep apart, particularly when they are romantically interested with each other and there's not much else to do during lockdown. So, you know, it's an interesting scenario. There was a running joke going around, and excuse my language, but it was like, don't worry, Jacob, we're not going to be giving you any COVID babies anytime soon. But I was sort of like, oh, doesn't make me feel better. So yeah, as long as they were within the same bubble, we weren't too punitive with any sanctions. But yeah, we definitely wanted to make sure that the behaviour that we were instilling in our students would be behaviour that they would take outside of the building if they had to go to the supermarket or go get a COVID test, etc. So it was about making sure that for our students who didn't understand often their actions and the impacts that it could have, especially when, thank you Germany for your COVID parties on YouTube and social media and stuff, you know, we wanted to be like, look, when you're New Zealanders, we're all looking after each other. You've got to practice what you preach, and we're preaching that it's a 2 metre social distance, and we changed all of our office spaces and staff so that I could be within, you know, more than 2 metres of my staff as well. So yeah, it was an interesting one.
Thank you.
Great.
So we just on that, we had RA staff that chose to stay on campus because again, RAs could also go home, but who were romantically involved, and they couldn't even visit each other in their own hall. So they're going 4 weeks, having been together for more than a year in some, you know, in one of the cases, not being able to have any engagement with each other in close contact. So it was challenging, but it was about that whole, they're in their bubbles, and if someone in their bubble gets contaminated, but then we find out that you've actually been cross-contaminating bubbles, then we've got no oversight of the spread, and that's, you know.
Great, thanks. I think this is a question for either of you. What online events do you feel your students engaged with most? And what mental health and wellbeing programs and initiatives did you put in place during level 4?
Yeah, and I think that's a really good question as well. I mean, Amy's got some wonderful colleagues that did some things on TikTok. He's a very engaging young man in his 20s, I believe, and I'm not as social media savvy in my 30s, so I wasn't going to be entering TikTok because that was their space. For us, it was, what became really evident was, again, online education, I don't think is a great equalizer, as many people called it out to be. I think it actually became very lonely, and it's a return to basics. So we just went straight into, what do you need? And it was, we want to know what other people are up to. So we would have, and again, that lovely Global Res Life Facebook group that Chris from the University of Edinburgh started was a fantastic method to share ideas. But for us, things like League of Legends, setting up a Twitch account so that students could watch each other play League of Legends and cheer each other on, and do it under their interhall competition banner. That was hugely impactful. We had 600 people watching League of Legends at one time, which we never would have had in an esports lab on campus type thing. Kahoot quizzes where there were fun questions about the staff. What is my #1 fear in the world? Well, students guessing all sorts of things, but it was about making sure that we're all human together. And that's why often I did my Facebook Live updates either from my home or from areas that I was, if I was taking a COVID break walk around the neighborhood, I would make sure I'm in a park, I'm not near anyone, I'm going to give you this update. So it was just going back to the basics and adding a human element there. We had the classic tea and toast drop-in sessions where at 9 o'clock we had an open Zoom forum like this where kids could just come and drink tea and not necessarily talk to each other but feel like they were connecting. We called it together alone time. So it was just going really back to those basic, how do we get people connected and talking to each other, and how to make it fun. Prizes work great. So what we did, as everyone knows, kids love a tangible outcome. So we did local donations to charities in the area that they were self-isolating. So whether they were self-isolating with us on campus or at their home, if they won a competition, great, Women's Refuge in your city's getting 3 safe nights in your name, or we're donating to Forest and Bird to plant 5 native trees in your local area. So that was just a great way for students to be able to go, I'm so thrilled that my local neighborhood where I'm isolating is getting something. So one of the things I think probably should mention is that even if students chose to move home for lockdown, we fully supported them pastoral care-wise as accommodation students. And then it was just lots of RA one-on-one check-ins. So those RAs not texting, because I don't like them having personal numbers, but we have special WhatsApp groups and Zoom sessions with them all. So yeah, I don't think we did anything amazingly innovative except show students that we still cared and found ways to do what they were doing and just bring it online. So we did debating online. We did, it was just, for us, it was how do we take our normal program and make sure that you could watch it anywhere in the country or in the world, because even if you're in America and it's 6 o'clock in the morning their time and it's 9 o'clock and it's online debating, they were getting involved. So yeah, it was just return to basics, and then the tangible outcome, because we couldn't give free food and free drink, it was donations to charities, and we chose to make them sustainable development based charities, so environmental or social development.
I think in terms of the mental health and well-being stuff, we actually found that because everything had gone online, right? Their whole social lives had gone online. All of their learning had gone online. Everything was online. If they had to move outside of their bedroom, for those that had gone home, because we also had maintained that contact with our students that went home, then it was with their families. So if they're getting frustrated with their families, then they were putting themselves back online. And so what we learned quite quickly actually is that students needed offline time. So we have a board game, cupboard, as I'm sure most of us do, a big stash that we went, actually, we can manage the cleaning of this stuff. Let's put it out there that if people want to hire these things for a couple of days at a time, so jigsaws and board games and all of that stuff, as well as then we had started getting requests in for crafts and arts when we did the Anzac memorial stuff, for example, commemoration stuff. And then we had people starting to ask, have you got more art supplies? Have you got more craft supplies? So we started ordering stuff in. And we had students doing painting and sketching and all sorts of things. So I actually realised that actually their way of managing their mental health was getting offline. So how could we support them to get offline? We're really lucky in terms of our spaces on campus and that they could actually get outside and go for walks without having, our security team were amazing in kicking people off campus. We've got beautiful grounds at Massey, Manawatu, and so a lot of the community were trying to come into campus and security going, no, we've got 200 people that live here, off you go. And that meant that our students could get off around campus and have training sessions together spread across the field and things. And so that was actually really important. And so I think, yes, the online stuff's really key in terms of the engagement, but have a think about how you're supporting the mental health and well-being by creating opportunities for them to get offline and just reset. Because we all know that Zooming can get exhausting. So this constant need to engage with each other in this space and not be able to read those social cues or not know whether they're being left out or that same group of friends that they made over the first 3 weeks, that they then had to suddenly separate from, all of that anxiety and all of those questions of actually getting offline can help with that balance. So just think about that.
Yeah, and I
Thank
think it's you know, just feeding into what Amy said. Don't overcompensate because we're in COVID-19. You've got a long road ahead of all of us in our business, and why do something now just because it's COVID-19 if you can't continue it? You've got to have that really genuine relationship. So like I said, you know, all of our wellbeing frameworks and all of our engagement, it was what we would normally done, but maybe through a different method. Because if I start doing daily events now, I'm not continuing that when they all come back to campus. So it was making that transition easier. So yeah, I would say don't overcompensate just because life's slightly different. Make sure they're safe, make sure they've got those basics, and then everything else is pretty much the cream on top, you'll find. So don't run yourselves ragged with trying to be super innovative, unless it's an innovative way to just keep people safe. So if you're delivering that service, that's okay, you know. So I know there was a lot of pressure from our vice chancellor and stuff too. What are you doing to be innovative? Well, the innovative thing is that we're delivering pastoral care online, no matter where they are in the world, as an accommodation provider. That's amazing, you know. So yeah.
Great, thank you. One last question. How did you get students to COVID test centres, each of you?
Mine's a really short answer, Amy. So I did not endanger. So I made a decision that my staff were endangering themselves by leaving their family homes to come and deliver their in-person services on campus as essential workers. So if a student required a COVID test, they had to book a transport themselves and make that way. So Uber was converted into a lot of, Uber was an essential service. So, and they had ways to get people to testing stations and have their little unpleasant nose swab. So it was the student's responsibility as an adult to make their way. Again, also, my university is in a large metropolitan centre, so some of those centres were within walking distance. But for me, I was making a big enough ask to ask a staff member to come in on campus. I didn't want to get into a ferrying situation, because the case requirements in New Zealand went down to, if you had a blocked nose, sore throat, watery eyes, headache, you had to get tested. Any cold or flu symptoms was being tested. So we were having students constantly being tested, and I just didn't have the resource to do that, and I wanted to protect my staff. So I don't know if Amy was different.
Yeah, I didn't care about my I had a staff member who I recruited 2 days before lockdown. He was actually an old RA who studied aviation at Massey and has been in Malta and Germany for the last couple of years, and came back to recertify before kind of getting his international pilot's license, and got stuck here from Germany because Germany went into lockdown the week ahead of us. And so I gave him a call while he was in Auckland trying to work out what on earth he was going to do, and said, come back and work for us, because like I said at the beginning of my presentation, we had lots of staff and resourcing impacts that were going on at the same time. And he actually happened to move in with me and my 3 children, because he was only going to be there for a few weeks. And then the day after he arrived, it was announced that we were going into lockdown. So he got stuck with us for 5 months. He literally just left and got back to Germany 2 weeks ago. So he also, bless him, is EMT trained, so works for the Red Cross as a volunteer over in Germany as well. So he was keen as a bean to jump in our big transit van with all of his gear on, and have, we only had 2 people that actually needed driving to a testing station over the course of the period, but so they were sitting right at the back, 2 meters distance from him in the front. He had all of his gear on, that he was getting them into the van safely. The biggest issue was, as Jacob said, when they stuff the big swab up the nose, it causes the person to gag and splutter everywhere. So it was, okay, how do we now ensure that the vehicle is okay? But again, between him and the fact that our science department actually was providing a lot of the everyone ran out of sanitizer, right? So our science department are busy, along with helping with actually producing the testing and etc., running tests on campus at one of our sites. We also were having chemicals made and provided all over the place, and so we were able to collect some of those quite early on, and like Jacob, learned a lot about chemicals and cleaning products and all the rest, and these were the first ones that were tested against to say that yes, they were COVID. They fought it, unlike necessarily all the others. And so, yeah, we had the things that we needed to clean the van in time for whatever else it might have been used for in coming days. So we had a specific staff member who was doing that stuff for us.
Great.
Yeah, a bit of a palaver.
Thank you. Well, I'm thinking we've managed to answer all the questions, which is great because it'll all be in the recording. So if we wrap up now, I'd just like to say, first of all, thank you so much to Amy and Jacob. To hear from universities that have gone into lockdown and come out of it, albeit in a faster timescale, I think has been invaluable, and some really useful points and similarities with our experience, which I think will help people, reassure people that they're doing the right thing in their universities, and some very unique insights about your experience as you opened up and some of the things you've maybe approached slightly differently. So thank you very much again, and thank you also to StarRes for organising this, Mark. I think I can see from the comments that people have really appreciated this session. And one other thanks to Amy and Jacob for doing this in your evening. Really, really appreciate the time you've given to us and the clear thought that you've put into your presentations. Absolutely fantastic. So thanks, everybody. We will get the recording up online as soon as we can. And just say goodbye now and take care, everybody. Stay safe.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Jen. Thank you.
Bye, Rita.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Jacob.